Okay, the next speaker is, as you can see here, Professor Derek Baker, and he's Professor of Agribusiness and Value Chains at the University of New England. And he's from New Zealand, he's been in the USA, he's worked in Russia, Scandinavia and Kenya and ended up in Armidale. Okay, here's a bit of story. So please welcome Professor Derek Baker.
Oh, yeah. Am I switched on? I can't really hear, so am I switched on?
There you are.
Okay. You will. Yeah, thanks everyone. So, yeah, my name's Derek Baker, and I'm Professor of Agribusiness at UNE, and recently we opened a Centre for Agribusiness at UNE, and I'm the director of that. So, you know, I'm all fired up with some places to go. Now, I sort of cottoned on here that a lot of people, particularly in my group, were going to be talking about things within the farm gate, and I wondered about talking about things beyond the farm gate. And then I had to think, well, actually, I've never been much of a fan of that division within and beyond the farm gate. I think really we're operating within a whole system here. And then I thought, I sort of looked at this title here, Growing Ideas for the Global Marketplace. And, you know, this word market got at me. Now, when you mix passion and pedantry, you know, that's really the ingredients you need for an academic career. And since, as you heard, I'm a newcomer to academia, I thought this must be somewhere I can really say something. And when I look at this word market, you know, the first thing that occurs to me is actually most of our transactions in the food and fibre system don't take place in anything that looks like a market. As a matter of fact, we have arrays of actors that are there, things that we like to call a network. And in that network, we've got all kinds of different actors. Some of them we're trading with regularly, some of them only occasionally. And, you know, I wouldn't be the first one to say that, well, you know, prices get generated due to demand and willingness to pay, and that gets passed back down the chain, and we must consider everybody in the value chain and so on. That world is rapidly dying. Now there are people in our trading networks that don't have anything to do with us. They don't know us, they don't know anything about our products, but with the quick use of an iPhone standing in a supermarket, they can radically interfere with our business simply by reporting an impression they have of something like animal welfare, too much gluten, you know, violating some norm of social license. So that our network is vast. No matter where we are, like it or not, our network is vast. And we have this sort of vernacular where people talk about value chains. You know, we have sort of linear groups of people all holding tight to each other, and if one of them would let go, something ghastly would happen. I don't think that's the world we're living in. I think we're living in networks rather than chains. Now, networks, this array of actors that get together, they really transmit three things. They transmit products and payments, and I think everybody's pretty familiar with that, and they also transmit information. And everything we've been hearing about the last few days is all the new kinds of information, vastly different volumes of information that are available, and that's a little bit of what I want to talk about. Now, we've heard a lot of people saying, perhaps in other words, that what gets measured gets managed. We also know that much of what the consumer is willing to pay for is essentially the information content of a product, and particularly some of the adjectives, if you like, that we add to food. Like the noun might be eggs, but the adjective is free range, or the adjective might be you know, cage free or something. It's that adjective that people are paying for. People are paying for information largely. That gives us the ideas for product differentiation. When we differentiate a product, we are changing its information content. And the third general thing to say that we've heard from a lot of people is that these increased flow of information, they are connecting agriculture to the rest of the world. It's that interoperability that we were hearing about yesterday. And you know, someone who's worked in agriculture most of his life, it was only really in the 1970s, and this happened at UNE, that we really got involved in measurement of agricultural productivity, which could be readily compared to the productivity in other industries. And you know, that was the 1970s, and yet those productivity concepts were at least 100 years old. So agriculture had a lot of catching up to do, and this advent of data, in the world I work in, the sort of food industry development, that ability to compare results in and out of agriculture and with other industries is a very valuable thing. But to be able to connect up to basically global databases and big data and so on, that's what others have been speaking about, and that's really the power that we see here. So I guess my take on this is to talk about things in terms of information as a source of competitive advantage for all of those kinds of reasons. And I wanted to say a thing or two about how, in the research sense, we understand the idea that information content of products can get passed all the way through so as to satisfy the willingness to pay by a consumer. And most people are sort of familiar with this linear concept of a value chain, that there is a product and there is a consumer at the other end. And the consumer has a willingness to pay, and we've done a lot of work at UNE on certain products trying to measure that willingness to pay through all kinds of experimental techniques, and have pretty good ideas about the quantity, the extent, the magnitude of that willingness to pay, what affects it. And at the other end, there's information there that might be that adjective that describes the product, and that information can be provided at a cost. And then we have a network here, and I've presented a fairly simple one where there's all these sort of left to right arrows here, but in fact those arrows can be going all over the place, and some actors within that network can be bigger and more powerful than others, and others can be occasional participants and so on. Now, there's choices to be made about which route to go down with this product, which contains a certain amount of information, but I want to talk about something sort of a bit more mechanical. And that is that the information about that product needs to be generated and attached to the product, and then the product needs to be passed all the way through a whole lot of hands, and basically with its information content intact, it needs to be passed to the consumer. So we've had, people lambasting the wool industry and so on. I remember the day in the wool industry where basically wool classing was considered a financially non-viable thing to be doing, and once wool all gets thrown into a pack once wool types have been mixed, it's almost impossible to separate them again. So whatever signal of quality there is there that on that wool, it's lost, it's fallen at the first hurdle, and it cannot be recreated. And what I want to talk about here is that these signals of quality, this information content, the information needs to be generated, then it needs to be transmitted. Someone at the other end of each one of these nodes here, they need to receive it, so often that involves having some equipment of some kind. They need to preserve that signal. And I've worked around the world at a lot of places where just very basic sorting of product, things like apples into different sizes. We put people through paroxysms to try to get them to do that, and then at various points along the way here, all the apples got remixed again, so the signal died. People need an incentive to preserve the signal all the way through, to receive it, to preserve it, and to retransmit it. And that's the only way that it gets all the way through to the consumer. Now, the point is that there is a cost to each member of this chain here. And whatever value added it is we generate through the information of that product, it is only funded by that willingness to pay. That is the only source of money coming into the supply chain. And the sum of all the other costs, let's leave aside the cost of producing the product and processing it and everything else. Leaving aside all those things, there is the sum of all those operations which need to be conducted on that signal so that it's preserved all the way through, and that is value added. Now, when I talk about source of competitive advantage, what's our task as a bunch of people here, and I speak about the people sitting this side of this line, as the leaders of agriculture today and leading into tomorrow, and we're going to talk later about how many years into the future. What's really the task? If we blur that boundary between the farm gate and the farm gate and the beyond farm gate, and we talk a little bit about what the sources of competitive advantage are, and I return to this information story here. Here's a fairly simple signal, but a bit difficult to keep alive. That kind of information scanning on a carcass, that's one component of a whole lot of different pieces of information which put together will be an index of quality which will be used not only later in the chain, but actually in the next few seconds when that carcass starts to get cut up into pieces. So this keeping this signal alive is a vital piece of what we refer to as business models. And ARFID is a sort of a third-party story. That's something, let's track that product, let's create information about it as it wends its way between markets. And really that competitive advantage and the establishment and maintenance and acceleration of that competitive advantage, the burden is falling on people in this room, because we need to get at what we refer to as business models, which mobilise the information itself and capability. And capability is about 50% skills and about 50% technology. Let's talk about what's in a business model. There needs to be a value proposition, and many people have been talking about that the last few days, so I'll stay off that. The value architecture is how, within a firm, a value proposition can be costed and have revenues and planning attached to it and so on, so that there's actually a way of doing things within the firm to deliver that value proposition. There's a financing mechanism by which capital, that is a large amount of initial money, is turned into a stream of revenues and costs, and really it's up to somebody else to decide whether that's profitable or not. Where I spend most of my time working is actually in this value delivery mechanism, which is what happens in that network and what communication structures need to be in place about product quality, about logistics like timing, about the trends that we're going to observe for that network to be sustainable. These two graphs were put together by MLA when they did a scan about 3 or 4 years ago and tried to map the value chains for all the major meat industries. And you know, just from this very simple exercise, some very kind of interesting exercises. Why is it in the poultry industry we see vertical integration between production and processing, and yet we've never really seen that? We've never really seen that in the ruminant meat industries. Why do we bother with all this intricate network of connections when basically we know everything either goes to export or it goes through one or two huge supermarkets? The fact is there's a lot to be said for examining a lot of these channels, and we've got research projects underway at UNE at the moment, for example, trying to look at this farm-to-fork model. Now, that farm-to-fork model is ideally it's a business model that cuts out the middleman. You can handle all your own quality signalling. You can do a lot of things to get your value proposition to market. And there's that word I'm not supposed to be using. What we're looking at here is along the way between farm to fork, there are opportunities to sell outside that initial channel. And if you're not benchmarking yourself against those opportunities, you're not making as much money as you could be. I talked earlier about value addition and the information signaling and so on. We're also looking at various points in this chain, what is the value of a particular piece of information? No one has ever put a financial value on using one stream of information as opposed to another, and that's another big topic we're looking at UNE. Now, so given those business models of those 4 components, here's my wish list, you know, for the rest of my career and leading into your careers. These are the things that our food and fibre systems will need to deliver. And I'll leave you with that. Thanks.